I did live in Ithaca at one time, and when I lived in Ithaca, my name's Tom Calarca, by the way, and when I did live in Ithaca, I did an article on the Underground Railroad, but that isn't what I'm going to talk about mainly today. I'm going to talk about the search for the Underground Railroad in upstate New York, which is the story of how I became involved in the Underground Railroad, or became interested, I should say, and how I pieced together the history that resulted in my 7 books. This is my 6th, and my 7th will be coming out. The new one coming out, it's called Secret Lives of the Underground Railroad in New York City, and the subtitle is Sidney Howard Gay, Louis Napoleon, and the Record of Fugitives. And I'm going to read from my books, but I'm going to start off reading an excerpt from The Search for the Underground Railroad. And this is based on an actual event that happened. It's a fictional account, but it's based on an actual event, on a trip that, well, I should say rescue, however you want to say it. It's based on Charles T. Torrey when he took 15 slaves from Washington, D.C. to Troy, New York in a wagon, believe it or not. And that's a quite incredible trip. I don't know of anyone else who did such a thing. I mean, Washington is quite away from Troy, New York, as you know. And he actually did it in one wagon, 15. So I'm.
And what year was that?
1841. Well, I'll read it to you and tell some of the details. Short, slight, and looking younger than his years, Reverend Charles T. Torrey did not look the part of someone who would defy brutal slave hunters in that year of our Lord, 1841. But Charles was a man with a fiery resolve to end slavery. Nothing else mattered. He had quit his pastorate to devote himself to the cause, leaving behind his wife and 2 young daughters, to assault the monstrous institution in Washington, D.C. Yes, in this nation whose creed claimed that all men are created equal, slave pens were plentiful and slave trading took place within sight of the nation's capital. He was fearless but a bit naive. It's not a good idea to go into the South and tell everyone that you're an abolitionist. Earlier that year, he had been arrested and spent time in jail because his presence had not been welcomed at a slaveholders' convention, which he was attending as a journalist. As he was writing a letter to his wife, there was a knock at his door. He rose from the desk. "Who calls there?" "It's Thomas." Thomas Smallwood was a former slave who had been freed 11 years earlier and was full of righteous indignation about his former status. He had introduced himself to Torrey after his release from jail, and they had formed a partnership to establish a track on the Underground Railroad, a daring enterprise even in the North, but a life-threatening undertaking in the South. Torrey opened the door to his apartment in the boarding house. Smallwood was a larger, older man, and yet it was the younger man, Torrey, who was in command. "So is everything ready?" "Yes, I've brought the horses and wagons," Smallwood said. "Everyone is at the church." Torrey retrieved his belongings and closed up his apartment. He had paid up his landlady and told her that he would probably be leaving that evening. They went outside into the dusky evening. The large Conestoga wagon had a nice cover to conceal his passengers. Torrey patted the heads of his lead horses. Smallwood sat next to him as they set out, but he was only going along for the ride to retrieve the freedom seekers. He would stay behind and continue his efforts running the Underground Railroad, while Torrey would remain in New York and look for work to support his family. After retrieving the 15 freedom seekers, who included women and children, and saying goodbye to Smallwood, Torrey set out on the road to Rockville, Maryland with his flock. At the time, most took the turnpike to Baltimore to head north, which is a more direct route. Torrey thought it better to go west and then cut back towards Baltimore on another road that they could pick up in Rockville, decreasing their chances of being confronted by a slave patrol. In the past, they would hire teamsters for the job. This time, circumstances required Torrey to lead them. Advertisements had been published for the fugitives from slavery, in some cases multiple notices, but it had been a while since their escapes. The time seemed right to take that final step to freedom as their trail had grown cold. The ride was smooth sailing at first, and the summer stars kept Torrey awake while his passengers mostly slept. Smallwood had supplied them with plenty of water and other provisions, and Torrey only stopped when necessary for the comfort of his passengers. As the night approached dawn, however, a problem with one of the wheels had developed, and he was forced to pull off into the bushes. He and some of the men were looking to see if they could fix it. When they heard the sound of hoofbeats, they became silent. Covered by the thick underbrush in the dim light of dawn, they were well concealed, though they could see out from their position. It was 5 men on horseback, and they looked like a slave patrol. Their wagon problem turned out to be a lucky break. Fortunately, they were near their first stop along the Underground Railroad, and were able to arrive before the wheel gave out. Their host found them a new wagon while they rested during the daylight. When night fell again, they resumed their journey. The biggest challenge was to cross the Susquehanna River about 40 miles distant. They would not chance taking the quicker route by using the ferry at Havre de Grace, Maryland, for it was almost certain that it would arouse suspicion and lead to their capture before crossing the Mason-Dixon line. The plan was to use the ferry at Peach Bottom, just a few miles over the Mason-Dixon line in Pennsylvania. Just a few miles away, there was the good Quaker Joseph Smith of Drumore, who was always ready to help weary freedom seekers. This time, their wagon held up. It was early morning when they reached the ferry, and the boat was available to take them across. Within a short time, they reached the farm of Friend Smith, and another day of rest and refreshment before resuming their journey north to New York. Now in a section populated with many Quakers and free black citizens who were active in the Underground Railroad, it felt like they were on the brink of the promised land. Several days later, Torrey was home with his family and writing to Smallwood that he had made a successful journey and had forwarded his passengers on the Champlain Canal to Canada in a new life of freedom. He was about to enter into another partnership with a like-minded abolitionist who was every bit afire as Torrey to free the slaves, Reverend Abel Brown. Now that's the only fictional section in the book. The book is a memoir, but I wanted to give an idea what it was like to actually participate or to be a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And Reverend Charles T. Torrey was one of the most daring, bold slave rescuers that in the history of the Underground Railroad. In fact, he was finally caught and put in prison for 2 years, where he eventually died.
Where was he put in prison?
I think it was in Maryland someplace. I can't remember the exact prison. All right, he was in a Baltimore jail first. I don't think it was a federal prison, to be honest with you. The federal government got more involved in these kinds of things. With the second fugitive slave law, gave them more power than the first. Well, what I've learned in my Underground Railroads research, and what has been, I guess, is very gratifying and maybe, how can I say it, beneficial to me, is that life is full of surprises. I've been very lucky. I found things just by accident. Partly, I guess in part, it's because I kept searching and I wouldn't give up. And as I look back on the years that I researched it, I started, my first article was in 1991. And so I've been doing this for quite a few years. But the crazy thing about it was, when I started doing this, I had no intention of doing any more than the article I was assigned to do. And I tell about it in the book. I was assigned to do an article, or I was doing a church history, and a man mentioned that his house was a stop, so my editor said, well, look into this, see what you can, what kind of stories you can find. And so I did collect a bunch of local stories, all oral tradition, and they put it into the paper. And another reporter did the same thing, and they combined their stories. And I really didn't know anything about the Underground Railroad, but the stories I collected. But I was going to learn very quickly. Myself and the other writer, we were invited to the local history museum in Glens Falls. This was in Glens Falls, New York. And it was standing room only. And because of this front page article on the Post-Star Sunday edition, it was the headline article. So anyway, it kind of gave me a lot of enthusiasm. Actually, I moved to Ithaca not long after that, and I was trained as a fiction writer, and I wanted to write the next Wizard of Oz, which I did. They actually reviewed it in the Ithaca Times, and now everybody laughs when I tell at the other talks. I still say it's my best book. It is. It really is. But time will tell. Time will be on my side. Anyway, But the book is entitled Hido Hidi Ha Ha. And it came out the same year as Harry Potter. I think that's probably what did it. Too much competition. Anyway. But, as they say, as one door closes, another opens. And, while I haven't been as successful as J.K. Rowling's, I've written a bunch of books now. And, I'm well recognized as an expert in the field. And I've learned so much. And I want to tell my story to people. And I want other people to continue to research it, because there's still a lot out there to learn about it. And the other thing about it is that I always see the Civil War. The Civil War, so how many books in the, you got 1 million, probably. No, so many.
Our store is only so big, but our military history
It's huge, right?
section it's comprised mainly is Civil War and World War II.
Yeah.
Mainly.
It's huge. Everybody's interested in Civil War. But the Underground Railroad wasn't about killing people. The Underground Railroad was about helping people. It was about people giving to other people and not asking for anything in return. Now, that is something that should be glorified, not all the people that we kill. And that's how I feel about they should be our heroes, not the people, the soldiers killing people. The soldiers do it because they're told to, but this is a way to. Our country is so militaristic. We all know that. But this is a good story. This is a story that that can be a model for kids. How they should treat their fellow man and woman. It's really important. And I think the story should come out. So my books have been written with a purpose also to help educate, because I have a lot of material in there that will be useful to researchers. But I want to tell you about one of my first surprises was when I found this Broadside. There's a section in the book where I tell how I found it. Okay, I'll just read you. It's a few paragraphs here. As I was expanding my research efforts, I reached out to one of the nation's historic treasure troves, the foremost keeper of early American history, the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. This particular Broadside was listed as follows: Vigilance Committee Office, Broadside, Albany, New York, July 1856. It was the name Vigilance Committee that jumped out for me. This was a euphemism often used to describe a group involved in the Underground Railroad. When it was presented to me, I was surprised to see how big it was. I have a framed copy of it today, and it measures 11 by 17 inches, though I believe the original is actually bigger. Now, you must be wondering why I framed the Broadside printed in 1856. Well, for one reason, it stated that the Vigilance Committee had aided 287 fugitives from slavery in the prior 9 months. Guess that's pretty good evidence that there was an Underground Railroad operating in Albany. It also reported the committee's expenses for boarding and transporting the fugitives from slavery, and asked for contributions to help them continue in their good work. The address of the office was listed as 198 Lumber Street. Even better, it listed the names of the Vigilance Committee, as well as its general agent and superintendent, Stephen Myers. So that was a really interesting find. I at the time, I had heard of Stephen Myers. I really didn't know much about him. But I passed the information on to some other people in Albany who were very interested in the Underground Railroad. And about that time, they were forming a group, and they did the research on the house, the 198 Lumber, and the name of the street had changed. The name of the street had changed to Livingston Avenue. And they also found out that the numbers had changed, so that 198 was actually 194. And that way they were able to actually find that the house was still there.
Oh, wow.
And that was quite a find. Now they're turning it into a museum. They've raised a lot of money. They've renovated. I have a picture of the house in the book. So that was really gratifying for me that I helped them find the house, and now it's going to be a museum. So I tell the story in the book. Yes.
Excuse me. I'd like to hear your experience in looking for Underground Railroad information. So you found the Myers house in Albany.
Yes.
And did you go to local historical societies in the area to find out what they had?
Oh yes, I had done a lot of that before I went to AAS. There wasn't that much. I mean, Stephen Myers was in this one book by, what was his name? William Johnson, I believe his name was. He was a barber in New York, in Albany, and he wrote his own biography, and he mentioned Stephen Myers. And there's a collection in Albany at the Albany Institute of Art. Actually, I think I went there later, but there wasn't really a lot, you know. There was something in the black abolitionist papers about him, but as far as where he lived, we had to go to the directories, the Albany directories, and then that was listed in the Albany directories, that house. But at the time, we didn't know that, we didn't have anything like this Broadside to say, well, this is where the office was, you know.
The presence of maps makes people feel that there was a set route.
Yes, I guess people do think that, they assume that, but there was really no set route. But these were just sort of logical thoroughfares.
Right.
Because people had to get, you know, and these were, they weren't taken because they were set up, because they were logical ways for them to get north, and best ways to get north. Sometimes these routes had to be avoided because there might be slave catchers, you never knew. As Siebert, you probably read Siebert, you know how he said, that there were many different possible options, and they had to take the best one at the time. They couldn't necessarily take a set route, although in my book, The Secret Lives, what I've established in Secret Lives, or what I've shown, I didn't establish it, is that they were working closely together. And I've delineated the network from William Still onto all these other cities. Secret Lives is about Sidney Howard Gay's journal, which was a 2-year journal, and he aided 254 fugitive slaves. More than half of them came from William Still.
Where was he located?
In New York City.
In New York City.
But he was only one of 3 different organizations in helping fugitive slaves in New York City.
In New York City, yeah.
Yeah, and this is the first real book about the Underground Railroad in New York City, The Secret Lives. We're just beating Eric Foner by 2 months, I think. But it'll be interesting to see what he writes, you know.
Well, he's a good historian.
He's one of the best, that's for sure. So, one of the things for me, as far as getting involved in it, was that, I'm not a professional historian. I just got fascinated with the subject. And after I found one thing after another, that's what really got me excited. And the biggest find for me, I'll just tell it instead of reading about it, it's in the book, was when I found the book about Reverend Abel Brown. Now, I was in the State Library in Albany, and in the card catalog I noticed this newspaper, the Albany Patriot. So I went to the rare books, and they said, well, we don't have it here, it's in a warehouse someplace, we're going to have to look for it. So it took them about a month to find it. But when they found it, this tabloid, it was huge, those papers.
Yeah.
They were heavy.
Yeah.
So I went through it, and I was looking, and then I see this, it's in the book, I see this little notice that this woman's going to publish a book about her husband, Abel Brown. So I had never heard of Abel Brown, and this was 1845, the paper. So I thought to myself, gee, I wonder if that book was ever published. So I looked in the card catalog, and it says 1849, memoir. So I went to the card catalog, and sure enough, there was the book, and nobody had ever looked at it because there was no stamp or anything on it.
Yeah.
So are you familiar with the state historians at all, or
The state historian.
in New York State? Any of the historians here?
Yeah.
Oh,
So-
Milton Surnet?
Yeah.
Oh, I called him up. I said, Milt. Well, I don't know if I call him Milt, but
I
doctor
don't know,
said,
it's all right.
you know, but I could call him Milt now because I've met him since. I called him up and I said, have you ever heard of Reverend Abel Brown? I figured if anybody in the state would know, he would, right? No, I never heard of him. So I thought, wow, because this book was a goldmine of information. And so I wrote an article for a magazine, it was a monthly in the Albany area called The Forgotten Abolitionists, and that got me an invitation to the Conference on New York State History, and I introduced Reverend Abel Brown. And since then, here's the book. And I annotated it. It's an unbelievable, it's a goldmine of information about the Underground Railroad in upstate New York. And Reverend Abel Brown, he just wasn't in upstate New York. He actually lived in Beaver, Pennsylvania. He went into the South a few times, like he was the colleague of Charles Torrey. He went into the South a few times and actually took fugitive slaves. And then Charles Torrey and him published the Tocsin of Liberty, which was the most radical abolitionist newspaper.
Mhm.
Yeah, you've read Stanley Herald, Subversives?
No.
Well, he tells the story of how Charles Torrey and Thomas Smallwood formed the Underground Railroad in D.C., and then Torrey was, you know, collaborating with Abel Brown. But when I found it, it was just an accident, but the thing about it, when I say life is full of surprises, I think it was 8 years later, I was looking for, well, the Tocsin of Liberty was the early version of the Albany Patriot, and it's very rare and hard to find. And some other issues have service, but recently I found that the Boston Public Library has the full run of the Tocsin of Liberty, in just hard copy. The thing is, supposedly, the Suffolk County Library in Long Island had it on microfilm.
Oh.
But you know what they did? They discarded microfilm and they threw it out. They stopped using microfilm. They said nobody's using microfilm anymore. And they threw that out.
They didn't try to
No, it was ridiculous. I called the librarian and complained about
Yeah,
it. I said, how could you throw that out?
yeah.
I mean, but anyway, they did. So nothing you can do about it now. But I really think the more we research it, the more we're going to find out. And the more we're going to find out about, you know, organization. And very little right now is really known about what happened in the South itself. You know, and that needs to be looked into, although, you know.
It's going to be very hard.
Yeah, it's very
It's
hard.
very hard.
If I had to choose the number one abolitionist, the most influential of all abolitionists, I'd say was John Rankin. Because he wrote those, you know, those letters, and then they were published I don't know how many times. First the Liberator, and then they were reprinted many times. And then he had a huge influence in it. He formed this synod, this Presbyterian synod, you know, anti-slavery. There were like 70 some odd churches in it throughout the Midwest. So he was known in the Northeast, he was known in the Midwest, and I don't know, it's like, you know, he's definitely one of the top ones. I mean, you have Levi Coffin, the greatest organizer. He was, and then you have Thomas Garrett is on the same level. And William Still in Philadelphia, you know, I mean, we know William Still because he kept the journal. And, I mean, you know that story. I'll just tell you briefly. Here's what happened. He was, his mother escaped to slavery and left him and his brother. Well, she went with her two daughters that were older. She left him with the grandmother. Well, the slave master sold them to a slave trader, and they were sent down south, him and his brother. And they were down there for many, many years, and they were sold to, you know, to different, well, they were with the same slave master for a long time, but eventually they got separated, and the older brother died, and Peter went to several different owners. He got married, had kids. Eventually, to make a long story short, he found a benevolent slave owner and let him work his way to freedom. He saved all his money, got his freedom, he went to Cincinnati, and he wanted to go home to find his family. And this was 43 years later now. He's 49 years old. He goes to, he's taking, you know, a steamboat and then a stagecoach, and I think there was a train there. Anyway, he finally gets to Philadelphia. And when they sent him to this Mr. Bias's house, or Dr. Bias, who was a member of the Vigilance Committee. And Mrs. Bias, you know, he knew that his mother went to some place along the Delaware River, which is, where Philadelphia is along the Delaware River. So he said, he thought he'd try to find his family. So he goes out and he has no luck, and he comes back, and Mrs. Bias says to him, why don't you go down to the Vigilance Committee office and see the man there? So he goes down there. Well, he knew his mother's name, he knew his father's name, and he goes and he sees this guy sitting there, you know, a black guy, and he says, well, tell me your story. So he starts telling the story. He says the mother's name and the father's name. And William Still was like astonished, because he knew that his brother was kidnapped. This is before he was born, though. He knew the story. So he didn't say anything. He said, well, why don't you come to my house? And Peter Still was like very apprehensive because he didn't know anybody.
Yeah, sure.
Who is this guy? So he went, he said, why don't you go to Mrs. Bias? Mrs. Bias says, no, you can trust Mr. Still, he'll be fine. So he went there, and then William Still was, what if I told you you're my brother? And the guy was like, what? And what if I told you your mother is still alive and she's here in Philadelphia? It was like 43 years. I mean, that's the most amazing story I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Amazing. But those are the kind of stories you get in the Underground Railroad, just amazing, amazing stories. I mean, that tops Solomon North by a mile. I mean, that is just amazing, you know. But anyway, and then his wife and children were still in slavery, and then they hired this guy, Seth Conklin, to go down and rescue them. And that's an amazing story too, what they had to go through. It's just, you gotta read the book.